So, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Too loud? Too good. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining me for this second lecture in the Jensen series. And for those of you who are not here with us last week, let me very briefly convey something of the nature of the project and what I've set out to do, and I hope without trying the patience of those who were kind enough to be here and return today. I began last week with 3 observations, and this is a rather long paper. It's because it's part of a book I'm sort of working on, not a finished product, so it was really wonderful last week to have this opportunity to talk and to exchange. But we're gonna have to just stop somewhere in the middle. So, Karl-Heinz, you have to be very impolitic, and please stop me whenever it's appropriate to stop me, because this is a lot longer than what it will take in an hour. So I began last week with 3 observations. One, that philosophy has long garnered a commanding presence across the fields of social inquiry, serving as the éminence grise, fundamental to its analytic grammar. Things philosophical and construed variably, as we're going to see, often provide the conceptual and aesthetic scaffolding around which the substance of grounded social inquiry is secured. 2, the second observation. If this is indeed the case, and perhaps too commonplace to note, something else, I argued, is strikingly evident and transpiring today. I see the current moment as signaling both a realignment and a quest to reconfigure a new space and style of social inquiry. As I stated last week, I think of this moment as this new summons, right, of philosophy in these 2 richly bivalent senses of the term, both a call on philosophy's authority and its repertoire of concepts, and a simultaneous challenge to its command over concept formation and to the evidentiary sites and sources for its claims. And the third observation, and finally I argued, or really rather observed, that there is something strange and striking in the absence of any reflection on the fact of this ubiquitous presence. What form it takes, how broadly it sweeps across, makes relevant, is designed to elevate and valorize as it subsumes the particularities, the cases, the examples of social inquiry's empirical horizons. What I didn't have the time to do last week, and it's just as well as I said because we did have time for discussion, is to identify what are some of the changing forms of social inquiry that would make it either in need of, disposed toward, more open to, both dependent on and defiant of, its dependence on and defiant of, in the face of what philosophy authorizes itself to assert and do, to command authority over concept formation, to create new concepts, and not least, as Deleuze and Guattari tell us, to adjudicate when we need them. Several striking and related changes, and this is really pretty schematic because I'm trying to go through it rather quickly, over the last 2 decades. And that is when I say the new, I do mean it over these last 2 decades, has drawn the temporal and spatial modes of ethnographic work and the very texture of historical and ethnographic writing into what were once more squarely philosophical domains. The first and most obvious is one in which practitioners of different approaches agree. Ethnography, and I think of ethnography here as Marilyn Strathern might put it, as an immersion within the contemporary or the archival field, is increasingly no longer confined to particular small community studies, bounded groups defined in advance. The project of ethnography and social inquiry more generally is not to study a culture, a people, a predetermined entity in a specific distant place, but to pause, if we can get ourselves and our students to do that, to ask first, what constitutes an ethnographic subject? When does ethnography happen? And how one arrives at that subject? A second reorientation follows. Ethnographic work increasingly frames its projects and mobilizes its methodological resources not around cultural entities, be they rural Javanese farmers, as I once did 30 years ago, or refugee camps in Palestine, or Tibetans living in beleaguered quarters of urban North India, but more squarely around problematics, as we'll see. Well, one could dismiss this move as yet another instance of French theory, capitalized, taking hold. Indeed, identification of a problématique is a dissertation requirement in France across many fields. And if one were to follow the evolution of a problématique as a concept, one would find it referenced as, when I do this, I'm not going to keep saying quotes, but I mean quotes, okay, in the foundations of Western philosophical thought. One need not subscribe to Foucault's architectonics to recognize the overwhelming presence of problematization as more than a new jargon. It's an ugly word, granted. But problematization establishes different priorities, an analytic position with methodological yield. To remind us of Foucault's description, I'll give it very briefly because it's such a succinct one. A problematization, as he writes, does not mean the representation of a pre-existent object, nor the creation through discourse of an object that does not exist. It is the ensemble of practices that make something enter the play of true and false, and constitute it as an object of thought. How something becomes visible and an object of thought has long been construed as a basic philosophical question, certainly one at the center of Foucault's own genealogical work. It is and must also be an ethnographic and historical question as well. What concepts are developed, when they get developed and worked upon, where and under what conditions and possibility, something becomes an object of thought, be it race, or sexuality, or security, or camp, the camp, are a very different set of questions than we've asked before. Paul Rabenau's most explicitly made problematization the centerpiece of his own program, but one need not subscribe to Foucault or Rabenau's elaboration to see as marking new ethnographic fields. At its center is a methodological principle that the we must not be previous to the question asked, that they must not be previous to the question as well. Critical to problematization are the critical and multiple emanations of the question, that grounded analysis. It's not the answers that are necessarily have. Rather than start with the social relations internal to a group and the political relations that close them off, tie them or subsume them to others, the emphasis is elsewhere, on capacities developed to live in contradiction, on people's critical reflections on solutions, failures, uncertainties, and duress. So one of the ways I think of this for my students is that if Clifford Geertz told us that what we study is interpretations of cultures, what we're doing much more now is studying interpretation in them, the critical faculties that people themselves harness. I see the most recent orientation not in the focus only on problematization per se, nor just in the turn to the fragmentation of communities, but rather in the ways in which ethnography has come to focus on what the historian of science, Hans-Georg Reinberger, calls epistemic things. Things which orient and have the capacity to make available new ways of knowing, as they call it, to question what we imagine to know, and the grounds on which we think we know it. For Reinberger, as he puts it, epistemic things are recursively constituted and thus intrinsically historical things. So their epistemology and history absolutely cannot be separated out. They derive their significance from their future, which is unpredictable at the real time of their emergence. Epistemic things for Reinberger are scientific objects, but I think one doesn't need to confine our thinking to scientific knowledge alone. It is the relationship between such objects and the arrangements of people, knowledge, devices, and communication that are produced around them, be that in the form of documents, debris, detritus, walls or highways, security towers, or abandoned homes. Let me take some examples, a little bit prejudice here, from my own students. Whether the issue is undetonated bombs in southern Lebanon as an epistemic object, as Vasiliki Touloutas studies, or the sensibilities that mortgages produce in post-socialist Poland, as Mateusz Halawa's ethnographic works make so strikingly clear, or the political communities forged by Vietnamese 3 generations later embodying the damages of Agent Orange and what Vietnamese refer to as the American War. Americans referred to as the Vietnamese War. Right? In the 1960s and 70s, what is striking, and this is so important and I think so exciting, is that subjects are not predetermined constellations of persons and things, but the alliances, divisions, and new alignments that congeal around them. Epistemic things allow us to reshuffle the boundaries between, as Michel Serres put it, what is thought to be known and what is beyond our imagination. They blur the boundary between hard and soft. They are epistemic things that are political sites in formation. One could parse this as a Victorian effect, but I think it's far more than that. Some of these new ethnographic objects are concepts themselves, concepts like security and preparedness and crisis that I mentioned last week, that circulate in a wide public sphere, producing new target populations and social and political kinds. Social kinds in the sense that Ian Hackney, philosopher of science, speaks of them, kinds of persons and places deemed susceptible, vulnerable, dangerous, expendable, with each of these assessments colliding, collapsing, accelerating, what they call into their fields of force, as Adorno would call them, and Marty J. at different times. I don't dare speak about Kant in this place and for this audience, but it is a Kantian question. Via Foucault, which is interesting in anthropology, at least in the States and the Anglophone world, and it's not for reading Kant, that increasingly pulls ethnography towards pressing and more proximate questions. What is this moment, and how does its difference manifest and matter today? A third shift follows, a more concerted treatment of temporality, an acute awareness that past, present, and future do not line up in their allegedly secure, linear, sequential space. More significant is what I see is this richer grappling with a simultaneity of verbal tenses in which we live, of what Raymond Williams perhaps over-schematically described as the residual, dominant, and emergent social formation, each operating with different weightings at different times. But even that formulation doesn't cover the range. Carol McGranahan, in a book, Arrested Histories, even the title gives you a sense of this as a different temporality at issue. Arrested Histories looks to how Tibet's present is reworked as a past and a future place. And turning to past held in suspension, occluded, or in Michel de Certeau's, as he thought of them, those histories déplacées, displaced, were drawn closer to the kinds of questions Merleau-Ponty posed. He had this phrase, it's really hard to pull apart, about pasts that have never been present. Pasts that have never been present. And only partially, therefore, reflected upon, and therefore only partially made present at the time. And not least to the radical potentials sequestered, and so often set aside in failed visions, unrealized utopias, severed possibilities, which to my mind, and as I'll discuss more in Lecture 5, Foucault's genealogical methodology both invites and provides the means for us to broach. So these are things that are sometimes considered non-events because they never actually happen. Rather than take an oil spill as an unexpected one-time catastrophe, young political ethnographers like David Bond are asking how our notions of the environment tap back on and make spills understood as isolated, accidental phenomena. Ho-Ninh Quan's treatment of the ghosts of Vietnamese and US soldiers rewrites the alliances among Vietnamese across intractable borders. Angela Garcia, in her study of heroin use today in the American Southwest, makes the case for an endless past, constantly repeated, and a futureless present, if you are looking there. My own book on imperial debris attempts to track the uneven sedimentation. This is something I'm still working really hard with. The uneven sedimentation of colonial histories in their vividly violent, active tense, not with a focus on sites recognized as formal ruins, all the ruins we already know, but on the verb to ruin as an active, violent verb. If the emergent has become associated with ethnographers of science, and I don't know if that's the case here, but in the Anglophone world, that everybody's talking about what's emergent. In critical theory, it has been a central node of political thinking for a much longer time. Raymond Williams attempted to capture, with the consequent structures of feeling, those inchoate forms of experience prior to any fixed ideology. Such subjects are not accommodated by the generic categories in which ethnography once worked. Complex interiorities were really once off our charts. They are not today. Understanding that political rationalities put competing ways of knowing in dangerous play, that relations of power are worked through in the conditional, anticipatory tense, sets the methodological bar high for how we broach why people do what they do, in dread, in anticipation, in doubt or despair, how they identify a problem, imagine they know it, what they name it, and what forms of knowledge they count on to survive and flourish, and at least what they imagine they already know, or are too keenly aware that they don't. A fourth shift I want to identify is marked by the status of the event, the capital E, and what work we do with it. Put simply, events are no longer examples of the enactment of a cultural form or a witness to one's ethnographic authority and being there. What constitutes an event in itself, what marks its parameters, its scope, its breadth, how an event puts culture at risk, as Marshall Sahlins put it years ago, positions critical events and events themselves as new sites of inquiry while animating new questions about them. Foucault's spare parsing of an event, this is one of my favorite definitions in the world of an event, as the breach of self-evidence, refuses the illustrative task once given to events that they just illustrate. And to my mind, revises the conceit of much ethnography, that we ethnographers of past and present, historians and sociologists, are the overseers of what counts as common sense and what it's about. For that breach in what has been taken to be common sense need not be a cataclysmic breach, nor a definitive rupture, nor an epistemic break. As I think of it, it's a moment when that which passed for the obvious no longer appears so. It's a moment that could be a different duration of discomfort about what we and those with whom we work imagine to know. One in which doubt and uncertainty about what is obvious is rendered uncommon sense, even unseen, and thus may become available and subject to question and inquiry. In my own work on the colonial archive, and in genres of documentation, these breaches of self-evidence, when racial categories did not do their proper designated work, when those assigned to one category of persons acted as though they were of another, when the prevailing common sense about who belonged where was unable to account for what people did. It was in these moments when common sense expectations were not met. I mean, Michael Hirschfeld, I don't know if I mentioned it last week, defines anthropology as a comparative study of common sense. And I think that's an arrogance on our part. And I actually don't think we know that much about it. When common sense expectations were not met and epistemic assumptions failed, it was here that one could see the slow and quick violence of political reason and the affective sensibilities they produce, reasserting who is a danger, who is rendered an enemy, the sliding scale that security matters and why some people do not. A fifth, I think it's my fifth and final, reorientation, perhaps too obvious to note, but with consequence. Ethnographic work increasingly abuts our own everyday, narrows and widens the space between worlds, brings the subjects of ethnography into an orbit that presses on what is near at hand and closer to home. What is actual? Eric Fasson talks now and advocates an anthropology of actualité, the actual. Not actualité in the French sense of the news, but of that which is actual at this moment. Michel Agier calls for an anthropology of la contemporaine, both working off Foucault's history of the present, as critical interventions in identifying that actuality while remaining squarely within. So this is not some distant gaze. These changes reflect a more emboldened sense of where ethnography can happen, a broader constituency of researchers from across a range of fields who have incorporated it as their own. It is a measure of the politics of the world, I think, in which we live, where forced movement, displacement, relocation, and volitional mobility are not the exceptions, nor necessarily recent inventions. It speaks to how much of the world inhabits homes, semi-permanent dwellings, and transitional holding pens. Looking to effects rather than causes, ethnography is less about remote epiphany, but about the quality of movement and unsettledness, of velocity and pace, about what remains durable and what is expendable in the logic, sensibilities, and things with which we so disparately and inequitably live. This isn't to argue that philosophy has provided the answers to how we inhabit this reconfigured ethnographic space. Rather, this new social and political topography makes, and this is a phrase of Gadamer's taken up by Richard Bernstein, makes new claims upon us. Ones that are both conceptual and political. Fieldwork in philosophy, to my mind, is one vital way to push us up against those questions that, as David Scott once bluntly put it, are worth having answers to. So on the argument that philosophy, philosophizing philosophers are more prevalent, if differently present, in anthropology than ever before, what follows is an effort to annotate the force that philosophizing commands in the space it inhabits. I address both the predicaments it generates and its productive possibilities. And my reasoning is simple. The many of us who study the social life of people and things find ourselves seeking genres of inquiry and writing that provide us with a capacity to respond to the political and analytic questions that we imagine are worth having answers to. So I'm using fieldwork in philosophy here in several ways, as description, as diagnostic, and as design, and consider how it may serve as each of these at different times. I see it as a description of what some earlier calls upon philosophy attempted to do, as a diagnostic of contemporary work, and at least as an emergent design of social inquiry on the horizon. Each of these deployments is shaped by the theme that I've been working with, up and against philosophy's authority, as I put it last week, to legislate concept formation and its claims. Social inquiry's call upon philosophy speaks to their common concerns as well as their convergent, if sometimes proprietary spaces they encircle and inhabit. So when the use of the term fieldwork in philosophy oscillates between descriptive and prescriptive. As such, it may operate almost as a performative in Austin's sense of that term, an assertion that attempts to make good on and enact that claim. One can trace philosophy's appearances, sometimes animating ethnographic and historical inquiry, else as a mere endorsement. At another level, it beckons for something different and gives weight to new problematics that had not been on the agenda. Fieldwork in philosophy, as I'm playing with it, and I am obviously playing with it, wavers between an activity and an honest, a promise and a prompt, a critique and a possibility. The term fieldwork in philosophy is neither new nor my own, nor is it one endowed with a particularly deep referential history, though I think the striking differences in its use deserve scrutiny, and I think it can help us think about it. The ordinary language philosopher, John Austin, the sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, and the anthropologist, Paul Rabelais, are associated with the phrase, yet each called upon it in ways that move in decidedly different directions, stretched and constricted, not surprisingly, by their specific research agendas. And with acknowledged respect for their renditions, I seek to describe some different ventures that may go under its name and are not confined to their usages alone. John Austin first coined the term in his famous paper that I mentioned last week, A Plea for Excuses, published in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society in 1956. There he proffers fieldwork in philosophy as a felicitous way, as he puts it, to describe his venture. One, as we know, more attentive to the work that language does rather than what it asserts. An approach which is about more than truth claims and truth values. As he puts it, it seeks to address, I quote, not merely words, but also the realities we use the words to talk about. Austin's attraction to excuses in particular, and his plea for them is pointed, as he writes, we should prefer a field which is not too much trodden into bogs or traps by traditional philosophy. And excuses, he tells us, in his almost ironic and spare prose. He says, I quote, form an admirable topic. We can discuss at least clumsiness, or absence of mind, or inconsiderateness, even spontaneousness, without remembering what Kant thought. So progress by degrees, even to discussing deliberation without for once remembering Aristotle, or self-control without Plato. We should be certain of what we are after. A good site for fieldwork in philosophy. Fieldwork in philosophy in Austin's making is able to unfreeze and loosen up what saying does. What aberrations in language use tell us about norms, and how the specificity of use matters, all without the history of philosophy needing to be invoked or weighing upon us. Still, the term was used almost in passing as a sway at analytic philosophy, conveyed in the oxymoronic phrase for a discipline in which fieldwork and philosophy could not be easily joined. Hence, in the piece from 1956, Austin puts it in italics. It served at once as a jolt to philosophical convention in the spirit of Wittgenstein, and a felicitous bon mot. As far as I know, Austin never returned to the phrase again. In brief, Austin's fieldwork in philosophy bids us to reject the abstractions of philosophical linguistics and its methods of inquiry, offered as an appeal to refocus philosophical and linguistic attention on the everyday, a word which is so prevalent right now in anthropology, on spoken language, to take ordinary language as our guide. Austin advocated for a, I quote, sharpened awareness of words. It was an alert to attend to what words do in the world. If Austin's injunction to let ordinary language guide philosophical investigation spawned a new understanding of action and a new approach to what we commonly do with words, fieldwork in philosophy had no such illustrious career as a phrase used to capture that impulse. Untapped for some 30 years, absolutely no reference to it anywhere else, maybe some of you can. It was to emerge again, resituated at the innovative project of another discipline when Pierre Bourdieu seized upon, without notably translating it into French. Just could not find a French equivalent. Bourdieu was explicit in the way he called upon it, to locate his vision of what sociological inquiry could and should be. He took up the phrase to describe sociological research as he conceived it, as, I quote, a good place to carry out fieldwork in philosophy. That reference appeared in an interview first published in 1987 that then became a chapter in Méditation Castillien 11 years later. And interestingly, he acknowledges Austin's coinage of the phrase, but Austin's striking point of entry and the essay in which it was spelled out, a plea for excuses, is never mentioned. Still, the borrowing makes sense. As for Austin, Bourdieu was signaling a sea change. So, I guess it's so sweet. As for Austin, Bourdieu was signaling a sea change, an intervention, a critique of philosophy's methods, but also, in this instance, a frontal assault on philosophy's authority to confer intellectual status on its own unreflective practices, and on the conceit that philosophical work is best pursued in the confines of one's study or garden, as a mere act of reflection and thought rather than practice in one's chosen domain. Am I talking to that? Is that what's happening? I can take this off and just... My ear is sticking in. If philosophy's presumptions for the targets of both Austin and Bourdieu, one can easily imagine what Bourdieu imagined he and Austin shared. Emphasis on, I quote, the somewhat down-to-earth relationship with the social world. This thing about the social world ends up being really important here. And ordinary experience, coupled to serious analytic proposals. But for Bourdieu, the analytic balance was completely changed. Curiously, given Austin's commitment to a study in words, and that's where most of his focus was, it was precisely philosophy's, I quote, excessive confidence in the power of language, unquote, to which Bourdieu's alternative focus on practice was aimed. So he turned totally away from just that focus on language. This isn't the place to rehearse Bourdieu's conceptual lexicon, so meticulously examined by his devotees and dissenters alike. But what interests me here is a more narrow concern. The ambivalence in Bourdieu's rendering of fieldwork in philosophy as a name for a politically pointed research agenda. For him, it was one that offered a visceral condemnation of the conditions and the dispositions that granted the discipline of philosophy its enormous capital as an elite academic sanctum with unbridled authority. A simple listing of his descriptives for his philosophy conveys really the acrid tenor of his recriminations. Philosophy, with its, as he puts it, puffed up words, its pretensions of grand citations, citing Schopenhauer's scatological criticism of philosophy as a pedantic comedy, namely the ridicule one incurs when performing an action that is not included in one's concept. And I quote Bourdieu here because he quoted from Schopenhauer, and this is how Schopenhauer described it, like a stage course that defecates on stage, unquote. Students in my seminars on the subject were dissatisfied and perplexed. They questioned whether Bourdieu's dedication to such a revelatory project, an unveiling of the emperor's clothes, in fact reduced his fieldwork in philosophy to a mere sociology of knowledge. They bristled at his purported aim to identify the sociologist's job as consisting, and this is how Bourdieu puts it, of trying to know and make known what the world of knowledge does not want to know, especially about itself. Bourdieu's venture can be construed in this light. Still, to do so would be fail to reckon with another aspect of fieldwork in philosophy that he was concerned to advance, namely what he called a negative philosophy, one that was both a tribute to certain philosophers, a rejection of certain philosophical gestures, and a revision of what philosophy could and should do in the world. When he sets out his task to, quote, make explicit the social conditions of possibility, there's Kant again, of what is defined at each moment as philosophical, his personal and political attachments are clearly at stake. Grappling with his attraction and aversion to the academic industry of philosophy, while firmly committed to what philosophy can offer, he puts it this way. For while it's been pointed out that the philosopher who likes to think of himself as atopos, placeless, unclassifiable, is like everyone, comprehended in the spaces he seeks to comprehend. Sociological critique is therefore not a mere preliminary, unquote. Well, the summons here, I think you can see, is multiple and complex. The word mere, right, in merely preliminary, betrays more than Bourdieu's distaste for the subordinate role he saw sociology assigned. It asserts his charge not to reject philosophy, but to radically realign its priorities and procedures in order to do it better. Bourdieu's fieldwork in philosophy was steeped in philosophy and what it could yield, yet irritated by the subordinate place sociology commanded in French theory. But it is not philosophy from which he turns away, and I think this is the interesting part of this push and pull. Philosophy is actually his irritant, that which alerts him to his own moves, distracts him, focuses him, binds his preoccupations, both animates him, and then it gets in his way. Philosophy figures more centrally in his work than among any French ethnographer, except perhaps Lévi-Strauss, in a distinctly different way. Who else would have devoted, as he called it, an exercise in method to Heidegger's pure philosophy, that he insisted must be subject to a dual political and philosophical reading. And he did this a decade before the latter's Nazi affiliations became the subject of public scrutiny. First published as an essay in 1975, he did this work on Heidegger, and then reissued it as a book in 1988. Indeed, philosophy and the resurrected terms of Greek philosophy from Aristotle's habitus, schole, disposition to doxa, as we know, underwrites his core conceptual lexicon. So philosophy here is his pharmacon, as Derrida would call it, both his cure and his poison, as it may be more generally for some of us. What he rails against is what philosophers do not do, to locate those concepts in the world in which people live and themselves within it. What he sought and worked toward developing throughout his corpus is clear, analytic concepts that open to the historical and political conditions for elite monopolies on cultural production, and the crude and fine distinctions that measure and make for inequalities. What he glaringly did not do, a project that has increasingly emerged at the nexus of a critical, philosophically inflected anthropology, is what Peter Locke and Jean Bien put so succinctly, to attend, I quote, to the conceptual fecundity of people's practical knowledge. What I would describe as a critical discernment of concept formation, an attentiveness to the force fields in which commanding concepts perform, how their fragility shift, their stability secure at some moments more than others. What will concern me in next week's lecture is precisely that, the mobility of concepts, and then their moments of arrest. Because they're not just circulating and moving every moment. They arrest, they stop, and then they move. What we will turn to in later lectures are concepts not as signs or placeholders of something else, but as the philosopher Adi Ophir put it, as in a response to my provocation on fieldwork and philosophy, he says concepts are, I quote, accretions of power in themselves. That's a beautiful, tight way to put it. Accretions of power in themselves. There was something more Bourdieu identified, a concern that Austin's reference to fieldwork and philosophy neither invited nor sought to address. Namely, what I'm going to later refer to, and I doubt I'm going to get to it, as the curative labor of social inquiry itself. The remedial work we imagine we should do with respect to what we take to become sensical in our world, are defamiliarizing gestures of which, as ethnographers, we are so proud. For Bourdieu, fieldwork and philosophy was a response, if not an answer, as he puts it, to the pretensions of grand criticism, an exit strategy of sorts from the aristocratic demeanor that philosophy assumes, a way to avoid the impoverished myopia of scholastic reason, a term he used over and over again, that he so abhorred. Not least, it registered his aversion to certain ways of living the intellectual life. It marked his own trajectory, and perhaps that of many of us. Attraction to and ill ease with the imposing assurance of stature and significance and security that the academy affords, what I call the dark side of comfort. Thus, beyond a sociology of knowledge, or rather steeped deeply within a reformulated definition of what that could potentially entail, fieldwork in philosophy was an intellectual and political weapon, a term he uses, directed at the immaculate conception, as he put it, of philosophy. What I see as the embraceable word, I actually didn't know in English until I looked it up. I said, where does immaculate come from? There must be some word immaculate. And it is. The word immaculate is stained, spotted, sullied, impure space in which social and political inequities thrive. For Bourdieu's intervention is not just cast out at others, but required, as he put it, studied awareness of the privileges that scholarly leisure affords. Here one finds resonance with Foucault's defining of critique as the art of reflective insolence, with an emphasis on reflective and reflexive. One turn not against others as a judgment, but against the norms on which one's own position and posture depend. The vigilance, and this is a word that he uses a lot, this vigilance was both epistemological and personal. As he put it, an instrument of vigilance as a weapon against yourself. This invocation of Greek philosophical mandates to pursue an examined life demands both assessing one's own conduct and choice of how one lives one's life, a return and reminder of philosophy as a practicing endeavor. Philosophy is recast as that which reorients its practitioners wherever they may be, to ways of being in the world. Or, as James Miller recently put it in a book recently published called In Examined Lives, to explore, I quote, the kind of person, the sort of self that one could elaborate as a result of taking the quest for wisdom seriously, unquote. How much is self-vigilance, in fact, guiding Bourdieu's practice is a subject in its own right that I have written about and I don't have time for here. But one could at least say that with respect to two issues, to his work in colonial Algeria and to his sharp separation of theory from the very history he lived, self-vigilance as a practice is open to question. In his impressive project, like many of you know, I'm sure, on the subtle distinctions, his book Distinction, of French bourgeois sensibilities, what remains striking is how firmly race remained unaddressed as a marker of French middle-class distinction. And relatedly, how deeply the Algerian War and France's colonial history so obviously threaded through the racial habitus of modern bourgeois France was not even discussed. Interestingly, these subjects are present in The Weight of the World, that enormous book that he did as a compilation. It was a huge collective project on the working class, but not on the middle class. Self-vigilance, we all know, is most acutely difficult when it is near at hand and close to home. I turn to Paul Rabinow on the making of knowledge things. Paul Rabinow's rendition of FIELDWORK in philosophy is more fulsome and fleshed out than Austin and Bourdieu. It is at once singular and framed in part contrary against what he argues were Bourdieu's incapacity to get beyond philosophy's self-defined form, which is kind of an interesting critique, given that's exactly what Bourdieu said he was working against. But like Bourdieu, and not Austin, he advocates for a strong embrace of philosophy's most ancient calling. Again, the word of vigilance against and care of the self. It is he who has most richly and fully reanimated and embraced the term FIELDWORK in philosophy with increasing precision to describe the nature of his own cumulative and collaborative projects. So it's both retrospective, and he uses it retrospectively to account for what he has done, and then prospectively to describe his ongoing research agenda. Rabinow's first use appears in 1989 in French Modern, where he cites it as Bourdieu's term and bypasses Austin altogether. I'm not even sure if he knew it was Austin's, but maybe he did. Dedicated to Foucault, French Modern was at once one level study of French urbanism and those middle-ranking social engineers charged with developing both the technologies, forms of knowledge that would produce interventions of social management and social control. But it was much more than that. Deeply inspired by Foucault, it more fundamentally tackled the conceptual and grounded relationship between the changing norms of reason. He kept talking about norms and forms and forms and norms. The forms of scientific, artistic, governmental models of reason that came to be defined. And arguing that colonial governance was created and consolidated through just these forms, he charted a path of knowledge production and the instruments developed for it that ran from colony to metropole and back again. It was an unusual intervention on many counts. Neither immediately recognizable to those in colonial studies, people just weren't reading it, at the heyday of colonial studies, and it wasn't recognizable to many anthropologists, perhaps not yet prepared for his definition of ethnography. Coming at the same time that the historian Frederick Cooper works in Africa, and I will urging a treatment of metropole colony in a unified analytic field that was to become the edited volume, some of you may know, Tensions of Empire, we each, all three of us, were seeking to scramble the bifurcated logics and historiographies that kept the analyses of metropole and colonies so distinctly apart. Bourdieu rightly lauded Rabinow's project, describing it, I quote, as a rich and subtle tableau of the social laboratories in which modern France was formed, but somehow missed underscoring that there was no modern France without the imperial landscape in which those technologies were forged. So how was this an experiment for Paul Rabinow in FIELDWORK in philosophy? Rabinow describes French modern, and this is interesting, in a telling way. He calls it an ethnography of French pragmatic philosophical anthropology. But then, on second thought, in the same line, hesitating on the aptness of that phrase, he writes, as we are now arguably in a post-philosophical age, 1989, a post-philosophical age, perhaps it's best described simply as a contribution to the emerging understanding of modernity. Period. If Rabineau then saw it as prudent to distance himself from something that might be considered a philosophically inflected ethnography, it did not change how deeply his work would remain steeped in philosophical reference and inspiration at every analytic turn, and it remains that today. Canguilhem, Foucault, Bachelard figure centrally alongside the letters and reports of engineers working on the Rhone Canal, and colonial high government officials like Lauté and Lanessan working out the politics of race and pacification and counterinsurgency in the urban planning of Indochine, Madagascar, and Morocco. Years later then, the term reappears in his introduction when Nicholas Rose to the essential Foucault. Later still, it more fully underwrites Anthropos today, where it appears in its most distilled form as Rabineau defines it, to identify how, I quote again, knowledge things are assembled. So you can see that call back to Foucault on how something becomes an object of thought. His 2007 preface to the reedition of Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco rehearses it again. It's the 13th edition of the book, bearing the title this time in his new preface, Reflections, not on Fieldwork in Morocco, but Reflections on Fieldwork and Philosophy. Here the phrase names an activity, as he calls it, a process of assembly on the part of those producing the authorized claim to knowledge and on the part of those seeking to find a form to represent that process. And after all of these invocations, I'm so happy that Paul said this, he still insists that fieldwork in philosophy emerges as that for which one, I quote, lacks a name. So he names it, he names it, he names it, and then he says it lacks a name. Something about the space. For Austin, Bourdieu, and Rabineau, philosophy invites and demands a new set of practices. Sometimes the project looks to be almost too familiar, as when Paul Rabineau notes that fieldwork in philosophy starts from the premise, and I quote, that traditional philosophical work should be combined with empirical inquiry. I mean, really. Stated so generally and flatly, few anthropologists of an earlier or current generation would ever think to disagree. But the generic cast leaves unsaid what Rabineau imagines that work to be. Like Bourdieu and Austin, he shares a conviction that philosophy not remain an elite reserve or a disembodied discipline. It must be a practice. But for Rabineau, this is neither his primary concern, nor does it remain his emphasis. In identifying the limits of traditional philosophy as a method and as a way of life, Rabineau, like Foucault, turns back again to the ancient Greek cultivation of the self that we're so familiar with from volume 2 and 3 of the Volonté du Savoir, the history of sexuality. Echoing Pierre Hadot's explication of philosophy as a way of life, as did Foucault. And not unlike, and this goes back again to Bourdieu, even though Rabineau doesn't mention it, Bourdieu's commitment to what he calls a Pascalian test of the self. This test of the self again is self-vigilance. But again, Rabineau pulls that vigilance in a distinctly Foucauldian direction, toward problematization. How problems should be identified, how choices are to be made. Most importantly is the insistence, and this is something that those who've been my students know well, it's something that I find really enabling and thoughtful in thinking about what kind of work we all do in social inquiry. An insistence that our scholarly problematics can neither be generated by theory or be foretold in advance. Rather, they emerge in specific historical conjunctures when conceptual and practical problems become available to question, visible to inquiry in specific time and place. Social inquiry, then, is both a response to a set of problems and a way of making them visible, and a site to invent them. And so it's doing lots of different kinds of work, maybe contradictory, maybe incompatible, but it is doing all of that work in his rendition. A conceptual apparatus that identifies what is newly produced and why it appears at a given moment. And it's this why it appears at a given moment that is absolutely crucial and makes it the historical aspect of it so important. As he puts it in a recent interview he just did last year, Fieldwork in Philosophy poses a challenge, and I quote, to be conceptually innovative, experimental in a dual sense, and appropriately rigorous approach to problems, and in the work on the self again and on others, that makes one capable of ethically undertaking such work. So this is the first time ethics starts coming into the project, the particular word ethics, which really has not come in before. This leads into questions, as those of you who are familiar with his work would know, around scientific knowledge, molecular biology, DNA, genome, and laboratory politics. But to imagine that what he offers is confined to these domains would be to miss the traction he offers. The key to my mind is something that Edward Said used all the time, a worldliness of the work that we do, that he called for. It is for each of us, then, to construe how our self-vigilance speaks to the problems in the world and how we in turn respond to them. But if worldliness is crucial to Ravenel's endeavor, the political form it takes is oblique, and the urgent response it enables is muted in his framings. Indeed, he is suspect, and he worries with Nietzsche about the desire to be relevant and timely, and seeks precisely, as he writes, the untimely observations, at the expense of the ponderous, detailed work forfeited in that rushed pursuit. Well, I'm not convinced that one cannot evoke, nor do I think is Paul Ravenel. And he reminds you over and over again in these later works, he says, look, it is worth forcefully, and he puts it in italics, forcefully repeating that there are a multitude of other practices anthropologists might pursue. Not everybody's got to work in a lab. Not everybody's got to study DNA. If his work is revolved around the relationship between science, ethics, and politics, my own has examined the force field that political concepts enter, and redefined by tying the genealogies of unexamined concepts to the forms of imperial governance today. I'm interested in training our attentions, again, on this fragility of concepts and their strategic opacities. And for me, that opacity is crucial in the inequitable political spaces that matter in this moment and that met out different futures. To phrase it somewhat differently, and this is the homage again to both Hans Gadamer and to Richard Bernstein's point of formulation, I think there are two things that kind of make our work go in different directions, even though he's one of my favorite interlocutors. One, my own concern with this issue of the claims that certain truths make upon us, how they do so, what protections they offer, on the concepts that occlude and thus weaken those claims. History remains central to my own focus on what historical fictions arrest. And history kind of, Ravenel's work turns away from history. In the early work, it's quite a focus on it in French modern, but it doesn't continue in that vein. The work, as I said, I'll talk about next week, looks to this vivid presence of political concepts that mute their relevance, ultimately pacifying their present force and our capacity to recognize their weight in the present. But secondly, I think there's something else at issue that none of these authors actually speak to directly. It's a somewhat different relationship with the political and with panacea, that exquisite term that Foucault resurrected to write about truth as fearless speech. As speech that has to put one at risk in order to even be considered within the game of truth. So this risk element, I think, is very important, and that bristles at convention and at consensus. We're both concerned with it, but I think we locate ourselves in different ways and the kind of practices that we each inhabit to answer to it. I want to return to Austin because in working through these various uses to which the call for fieldwork and philosophy has been put, Austin might seem the most remote, right? The most distant, and the least relevant. Neither directed at the politics of knowledge, the making of knowledge things, or reflexively at the philosopher king himself. Austin cites of empirical work and a plea for excuses. The dictionary, sort of a weird three sets of them. The dictionary, the tort law, and psychology are of such different scales, so close and so far from the urgencies that press upon us, they seem a poor excuse for ethnographic and historical work. But perhaps Austin suggests more methodologically enabling possibilities than his successors allowed. For neither Bourdieu nor Ravenel offer even an indirect, implicit acknowledgement of the stunning complexities of excuses as a specific and unique site of social inquiry, nor the strategies that Austin used to assess them. Neither take up what excuses make visible and the conditions under which they are required, nor do they address the subtle adverbial forms. And these are ones that really took Austin inadvertently, unknowingly, unintentionally, that operate as the moral relinquishing and distraction in which excuses partake. It is not excuses per se that may be of interest, but the methodological insight that Austin convened to locate what excuses tell us about how we absolve ourselves, partially and conditionally, from responsibilities in the world. Reading Austin, Bourdieu, and Ravenel side by side, students in my fieldwork and philosophy seminars latched on to Austin's unadorned proposals with excitement, and I think for really good reason. They found his invocation of excuses and responsibility offering analytic traction, political salience, and fresh methodological opening all at the same time. As terms that identify the moral landscape in which people attempt to cover themselves, excuses, as Luc Boltanski argues for justifications, open to nuanced distinctions of what we know and what we feign not to understand. Excuses for Austin were a particularly rich class of ordinary language, common action, everyday things, a linguistic class of actions from which one could glean cases, as he puts it, where there has been some abnormality or failure. That's from 1955. Austin turned attention to particular forms of the seemingly banal, those adverbial phrases that make up our unreflective ethical ground. And I think that's the key, this unreflective ethical ground that he's trying to get hold of. He sought to consider clumsiness, tactlessness, carelessness, inattention, and the conditions under which they are considered adequate to account for the need for the excuse and when they're not. Social inquiry, as I know, barely touches on these common ways of living with the contradictions in which we are so deeply embedded. But why not? We are timid in the face of doubt, among those with whom we work and about whom we work, somehow convinced that we must show the clarity of people's dispossession or dominance or subordination in a world that seems to distribute possibilities so differentially. In my own field, of colonial and post-colonial predicaments, where the subaltern assumes a private, sanctimonious place, we rarely touch on the attractions and contradictory desires that colonial situations compel and afford. It's just not politically correct to do so. Excuses, Austin tells us, not only signal breakdown, affecting different parts of stages of the machinery of action, but allow us to distinguish the different forms that unaccountability takes and the gradations among them. These are really fine-grained details of comportment, verbal, affective, physical conducts that forgive us for what we refuse to know. Austin's fieldwork in philosophy, in part, hinges on those failures in the order of things. It's not unlike one of Foucault's most provocative definitions of the event that I just mentioned, this breach of self-evidence, when common sense fails, when implicit epistemic guidelines do not do their requisite work. For both, then, it's in this breach, and what constitutes a breach, that insight becomes possible. For Austin, breakdowns can map more closely the moral landscapes in which we live. Well, adverbs, one could argue, though this was not Austin's project, do a great deal of surreptitious political work. In examining what he calls all the ways in which an action may not be free, unquote, he invites us to pursue and peruse the unfreedoms in which we operate and the forms in which they are cast, the relinquishing of blame, the inadvertent slips that remind us that ignorance is often just another etymologically proximate way to ignore the inequities on which we depend. Which is to say that fieldwork in philosophy is more than an invitation to pause, but a demand to do so, to rest, at least in my reading and my rendition of it, to rest ourselves in the conventions that avoid the much more messy states that most of us have. The history of these conventions are not in the passé composé. Conventions that allow us to distinguish ourselves so easily from colonial agents of another time. We live and breathe these inequities and partake